Man overboard. As I sit here on the boat tonight, I realize I missed yet another yearly celebration. It's not a day that most towboaters hold in high regard, or one that I have ever known of a riverman asking for time off to celebrate. Although I did work with a Satanist one time, and had he made it long enough on the boat, this might well have been a day of importance to him. It is October 31, All Hallows Eve, more commonly known as Halloween. Some say that Halloween originated as a Christian's harvest festival and feast, while others maintain that it has pagan roots. I don't know if it was the pagans, the Christians, or a combination of the two that invented Halloween, but the traditional focus of Halloween has always been to use humor and ridicule to confront the power of death. Death is a natural part of life, and if you have no sense of humor about it, then it will rule you. I learned early on in my career that it was never a good idea to let any of your crew members know that something bothers or scares you. Towboaters have a lot of time on their hands and can be creative when it comes to practical jokes and horseplay, so discretion is a must on a towboat. I will never forget the first time I got the shit scared out of me on a boat. It was by a practical joke rather than anything I have a phobia of. I think it was my first hitch, if I remember correctly. I was on a POS, piece of shit boat, which seemed to be the only kind of boat available to me in the early days. The outside loudspeaker for that boat's hailer system was mounted on the top of the wheelhouse. At some point, the mount had rusted in two, and the attached bullhorn was lying on the deck on top of the wheelhouse. The captain had asked me if I could drill some holes in the hood over the wheelhouse and mount the bullhorn at the edge, pointing down so that it could be heard properly from the deck. Being as green as I was, and with little direction from anyone of authority, I had been trying to figure out exactly what my duties were. I stayed busy trying to do a good job, but there were times that I simply didn't know what to do. Finally, I had direct orders from the captain that involved a task I knew I could accomplish. I gathered everything that I needed for the job, climbed atop the wheelhouse, and went to work. The outer edge of the wheelhouse had a 6-inch high handrail that ran all the way around the wheelhouse and connected to a ladder at the back. In order to reach the edge of the hood where the captain wanted the speaker mounted, I had to lean way out past the small handrail. The handrail was poking into my midsection below my hip, and I was teeter-tottering up there, almost at the tipping point. I have never been one particularly susceptible to acrophobia, but the possibility of a 30-something foot drop to the bottom deck, which was made of steel, had my adrenaline flowing pretty good. Especially considering the fact that I felt like someone ought to be holding my feet down before gravity and physics worked their magic and flipped my ankles up to where my ears were currently. To make matters worse, I was holding on with only one hand while I manipulated a drill that was trying to throw me further off balance with the other. When the drill bit was about to break through the hard, thick steel making the first hole, an ear-piercing blast of sound exploded right behind me. Son of a bitch! I almost dove head first right off of the wheelhouse. What the fuck was that? Holding on for dear life required both hands and was at the expense of a cheap Black & Decker drill that swung down, cracked a wheelhouse window, then sashayed back and forth a few times before finally unplugging itself from the extension cord and falling quickly to its death on the bottom deck, where it shattered into a million pieces. In my mind's eye, I could envision the same thing happening to my head, mixing blood and brain matter in with the bits of plastic, metal, and electronic components of the disintegrated drill. I was in full-fledged panic mode, and I knew it was over for me. My heart jumped into my throat and was pounding so hard that I thought blood would shoot from my ears. There I was, still struggling with my equilibrium, sure that I was losing my battle with gravity, when I looked into the wheelhouse window and observed the captain laughing like a wild hyena. He had thought it funny to blow a prolonged blast on the huge air horn that was mounted right behind me while I was hanging precariously over the side of the wheelhouse. In order to accentuate his little attempt at humor, he tooted the horn with a short blast and laughed even harder. Finally, I scrambled to the safety of the deck behind the inadequate handrail and laid flat on my back on top of the wheelhouse while a metronome made from a sledgehammer tattooed my insides like a bass drum. I was wondering if anyone had ever died of a heart attack at such a tender age as me, but I was thoroughly convinced that it was about to be my demise right there in the hot sun on top of a towboat wheelhouse. I don't know how long I laid there waiting for the rest of me to catch up with my heartbeat, but sure enough, I eventually began to calm down. I never reached a state of tranquility, however, because once the initial shock wore off, I got mad and my adrenaline spiked once again. That son of a bitch! I am sure that when I looked down at the captain through the wheelhouse window during my tightrope performance, my eyes were the size of saucers and I had a comical expression on my face, but that fool had damn near killed me and I had absolutely no sense of humor about it. There's probably 10,000 comedians out of work and that captain thought he was funny. I jumped up with vengeance in my mind and murder in my heart. I was going to kill that motherfucker, and God himself wasn't going to be able to stop me. I bolted for the wheelhouse ladder, intent on a violent raid of the wheelhouse and a prompt and bloody slaying of a slapstick captain. Not paying attention to my footing, I tripped over the cable that connected the big brass horns to the pull handle inside the wheelhouse, causing yet another ear-splitting blast of the horn as I fell flat on my face and bloodied my nose on the cursed 6-inch high handrail. In considerable pain, I rolled over onto my back and found myself once again lying prostrate on the wheelhouse roof with my heart pounding in my chest. I guess the good Lord could, and did, stop me after all. With the wind knocked from my sails, I lay there trying to regain my senses and actually thought the situation through. It is funny how getting knocked on your ass will give you a pause for reflection. I was at a point in my life where I really needed a job, and my intended attack on a captain surely would not help my career advance by any means. I was weighing the situation in my mind and praying for guidance, because I was still divided but leaning towards being convinced that violence would be well worth the price that I would have to pay. Sometimes there are lines crossed when the cost doesn't matter anymore and action is demanded, regardless of expense. In the end, prayer won out over pride and I grudgingly forced my temper and anger into submission. Once my decision was made, I was determined not to let that lunatic captain know he had really got my goat. I used the underside of my t-shirt to clean up my busted nose the best that I could and calmly made my way down the ladder and into the wheelhouse. The captain was still having a satisfying laugh at my expense, not realizing how lucky he was to still have teeth to show his emotion. I put on my happy face and called forth my sense of humor and let him have his joke. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Boy, did I want to do some of the Lord's work that day. The days passed without further incident, and eventually we obtained another cheap-ass drill to replace the busted one on the deck. Our comical captain once again told me to fix the bullhorn on top of the wheelhouse, and it was a sheer act of will for me to rein in my ire and not tell him to go take a flying rat's ass leap off the Grand Canyon with a 10-pound sledgehammer. Instead, I said, "Yes, sir," and went on about my business, determined that I would not be hanging over the edge of the wheelhouse with his dumb ass on watch. I had decided to complete the job during the captain's off watch, but then a great idea came to mind. Instead of mounting the bullhorn while the captain was sleeping, I secretly set up for my own little practical joke. During the pilot's watch that afternoon, I took a change of my clothes, a roll of fishing line, and a bag of oil absorbent pads and put them on the top of the wheelhouse in a trash bag that I duct taped to the radar stand so that nothing would blow away with the wind. Fortunately, the pilot had no interest in anything the deck crew was doing, so he paid me no mind and did not question anything I was doing as I prepared for my performance. The next morning, I gathered the things that I would need to affix a bullhorn to the hood of the wheelhouse and made my way to the wheelhouse. The captain was always in a foul mood early in the morning, and he was a bit perturbed that I had not already finished fixing the bullhorn. I didn't bother to tell the jerk that were it not for his stupidity, the project would have been completed a week before. Instead, I smiled and calmly went about my business, knowing that I would have the last laugh. The first thing I did after I climbed on the wheelhouse was to use a crescent wrench to unscrew the nuts from the cable clamps that connected the cable of the horns. I wanted no more emergency situations arising from a blast of that dag-blasted thing. I then proceeded to drill in the second of 3 holes, once again hanging over the edge of the wheelhouse. As I was doing so, I was keeping an eye on the captain through the wheelhouse window to see what he was up to. The captain was definitely not a morning person, so he seemed to be content with sitting on his ass vegetating while he steered the boat. After the second hole was drilled, I set my plan of revenge into action. I used the oil absorbent pads to stuff my extra set of clothes with in order to make a dummy. I tied the fishing line to the dummy so that I could control it like a master puppeteer. I then made some scrambling noises, stomped on the top of the wheelhouse, screamed, "Oh shit!" and slung the dummy over the starboard side down to the second deck. As soon as the dummy hit the deck, I pulled the fishing line and dragged the dummy around the stern of the second deck so that it could not be seen. Like an agitated hornet protecting its hive, the captain flew out of the starboard wheelhouse door, looking down below to see where I had fallen to. Had he looked up, he would have seen me standing right above him with a satisfied grin on my face. I was about to start laughing and reveal myself when I read the captain's body language and realized he was in a panic. Evidently, he figured that I had fallen overboard all the way to the water, got sucked under the boat, and was at that moment being chopped into bite-sized pieces of chum. That's good enough for him, I thought, and decided to remain quiet and let his apprehension build a while longer. In a frenzy, the captain rushed back inside the wheelhouse, took the engines out of gear, and sounded the general alarm to alert the entire crew of a man overboard. I quietly lay down on the wheelhouse top deck, took a break, and enjoyed the sounds of all the excitement while I caught a few rays of sunshine. The crew members had all hit the deck with handheld VHF radios and were frantically searching all around the boat and keeping a sharp lookout on the stern for any sign of little old me. I have to admit that I felt a surge of guilt at playing such a dirty trick on the rest of the guys, but I was sure they would get a kick out of it when they realized it was retaliation aimed at the asshole captain. Once I figured that I had let my trick run for about twice as long as my time of turmoil spent on top of the wheelhouse from the captain's prank the week prior, I eased down the ladder and calmly walked into the wheelhouse. The captain was extremely busy, multitasking, shouting orders over the VHF radio while also talking excitedly to someone on the boat phone. He barely noticed that someone had entered the wheelhouse and took a seat on the settee behind him. I was enjoying the show when the captain finally became aware of someone's presence in the wheelhouse with him. He started to turn toward me as he asked, "Did you find him?" He finally faced me and realized that I was the one in the wheelhouse with him. The captain's jaw dropped and he looked like a man who had seen a ghost. You would have thought the wheelhouse had been immediately pulled into the vacuum of a black hole or something. All of the excitement and energy of the second before was sucked right out of the room, leaving it so quiet that you could have heard a fish fart at the bottom of the bayou. The captain was ghost white pale, and I thought he might be only moments away from a coronary. I knew the feeling quite well. It was time for me to laugh at him, and I wasted no time breaking the silence with a well-deserved belly roll that was literally good for my soul. I could tell the captain was not amused, but that fact mattered not to me. Consequences and repercussions be damned. I was determined to enjoy the immediate results of my hoax. And enjoy it I did. The captain finally picked his jaw up off the floor and whispered to whomever he was talking to on the phone, "I will call you back." Come to find out, the captain did not have nearly the sense of humor that his actions the week before indicated. There was probably a boatload of restraint on both our parts that kept the situation that immediately followed from becoming physical. I had won the battle, but since I had decided to go head-to-head with the high captain, I lost the war. We were in the canal approaching the 193 boat store where I was deposited in short notice, fired from the vessel, and most probably from the company as well. As it turned out, getting fired was extremely satisfying after all, no matter how bad I needed a job. I had absolutely no money for transportation to get myself home, but my current situation did not put a damper on my spirits in the least bit. I was right proud of myself, and all the money in the world could not buy the feeling of victory I was currently enjoying. From the landline at the boat store, I phoned the main office and asked to speak to the personnel manager. As soon as he realized to whom he was speaking, he began to cuss me for everything I was worth. Patiently, I waited for him to get it all out of his system, knowing that the day had been so good that he could not ruin it for me, no matter what names he called me. Besides, I had been called far worse by better people, and I have an ex-wife, so the competition is fierce when it comes to offending me. I took that cursing in stride and never once attempted to interrupt the personnel manager. Fortunately, he could not see me smiling the whole time he was yelling at me over the phone. I believe that man actually invented new four-lettered explicitives to call me. "You no good, yellow-bellied, green-dick, left-handed, Lebanese, cocksucking son of a collard green-eating motherfucking whore," or something to that effect. I have to admit the personnel manager was good at his job and extremely well versed in the art of ass-chewing. I was thoroughly impressed and severely chastised all at the same time. Truthfully, it was all I could do not to bust out laughing at him too for his colorful command of the English language. However, I was in desperate need of transportation, and the fire-breathing dragon on the other end was my only hope of salvation. Somehow, I managed to mask the act of choking back laughter and made it sound more like mournful sobs of regret. I'm not sure how long the personnel manager pitched his little fit, but once he ran out of steam, he finally asked what I had to say for myself. With great effort, I donned my sad face and meekly told him my side of the story, the full story. By the time I finished my tale, the personnel manager and I were both cackling like geese on crack. Despite having a job that oftentimes left him unpopular with the employees, the personnel manager had a pretty damn good sense of humor. Besides, no one likes a prankster that can dish it out but can't take it. Fortunately for my cause, the captain had not called the Coast Guard to report a man overboard, so authorities had not been involved in the situation. All of that added up to the personnel manager taking pity on me. He hung up with the promise that he would see what he could do and call me back. I guess about a half an hour later he did call me back with the good news that another company boat would be transiting through that area within the next few hours. The crew was short-handed and really needed some help, so they picked me up on the way through. Not only was I not fired from the company, I didn't even lose a single day's pay. Since those early days on the deck, I have seen about every type of weirdo you can imagine and have witnessed a number of phobias in the process. I have seen arachnophobia, ophidiophobia, claustrophobia, homophobia, and the list goes on and on. I know someone who has a fear of those blower air dancers that are used for advertising. I even have a phobia myself that has left me dancing around, screaming like a little bitch from time to time. Of course, I will not share with you what my phobia is because it is none of nobody's business, and I would not risk one of my smart-ass crew members finding out. I remember a tough old Alabama redneck who had no clue he was scared of storms until we were on a towboat together right in the main path of Hurricane Rita. A window on the boat imploded from the gale force winds, and I was convinced that we were about to have to use the defib unit on that poor boy. He did survive, but I think he chose to end his towboat career that day. Old Gus was good at scaring green deckhands off the boat by telling them all the things he imagined Jody was doing to their old ladies while drinking their beer and driving their Cadillacs. That worked for Gus fine until one day we were going through a lock, and Gus started telling our deckhand how much fun Jody was having with his woman, and the deckhand said, "Captain Gus, I don't have to worry about my woman. She has a girlfriend that takes care of her." I laughed that day, but it also taught me a lesson. Never let anyone know that anything bothers you. Anyway, this story is supposed to be about Halloween, and I've been rambling on for way too long. There was one particular Halloween when I was fired from a company, along with the entire crew, including the captain. In my defense, I did not have an actual hand in the events that left us unemployed. I was found guilty by association, and since I was unwilling to throw my shipmates under the boat, so to speak, I ended up as collateral damage. It all started sometime late in September or early October of a year that I can't recall because of too much whiskey under the bridge. Whatever year it was, I was still on the deck. As usual, I had been on the boat for some time, decking by myself, without the benefit of a deckhand to relieve me. Sleep was sporadic, and I was worn to a frazzle. Finally, a deckhand was sent to help out. When he arrived, I was pleasantly surprised to find that he wasn't a good-for-nothing piece of trash, which was more common than not in those days. It was the norm most of the time to get a deckhand that was looking for a meal, a place to sleep, and a bag of dope when he got off. The guy that showed up that day was a big old muscular fella, about 6 feet tall, 220 pounds, from West Texas, and wearing a cowboy hat. My first impression was that we had finally found a hand that would earn his salt. My initial assessment of the young man was right on the money, and he quickly became a valuable asset, to me anyway, although I think he became more of a target for the rest of the crew after they learned of his phobia. We were on a contracted run at the time from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we never left the river. The newspapers we had received recently at the fuel docks were full of story recaps about a group of teenagers out of Baton Rouge that had gone on a nationwide killing spree the previous November, claiming that they were, in fact, vampires. Now, I didn't think too much of it when I went to wake up old Tex on the boat the first time and noticed that he was sleeping fully clothed with his overhead light on. My first impression was that he was tired from traveling and had piled up on the bunk and fell fast asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow. The second time I woke him up and found him sleeping the same way, I started to wonder what the deal was. Maybe he didn't trust the captain's driving and was prepared for the worst in the event of an emergency. Or he was uncomfortable with one of the crew members, possibly me. Ain't it funny how humans are such vain creatures that we imagine everything has something to do with us personally? After waking him the third time, I had to ask why he was sleeping fully clothed with his light on. "You don't trust us, bro?" I asked. As dead serious as any man I have ever seen, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Man, you ain't heard? They have vampires around here." I didn't laugh or even crack a smile because I knew from his body language and the look on his face that he was not joking about his sleeping habits. Oh boy, my hard-working deckhand, who I was so proud of, was as screwed up in the head as the rest of the ones who were sent out. I was nearly floored by his revelation, and I took a step back like his phobia was contagious. I have to admit that I was a little bit weirded out knowing that we had a crew member who was actually deathly scared of vampires. At first, I kept his hang-up to myself and didn't share it with anyone, but the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. Maybe I had even started to fear for old Tex. I was confused and decided to talk to the captain, Tom, in confidence about it. Making that boy's fears known was an action that I would live to regret. Soon enough, the entire crew was aware of Tex's complex, and they wasted no time in finding subtle ways to scare the shit out of him. Fishing line was rigged to facilitate the opening and closing of cabinet doors when there was no one in the galley. Things were rigged to go bump in the night in his bunk room, and there was always spooky sounds coming from somewhere. They tortured that poor boy, but he was rather tough and he endured it all. But I was afraid we were about to lose a good deckhand over a bunch of bullshit. As mate, I made my observations known and showed my ass about it, and as any good captain will do, Tom ignored what the mate had to say and allowed the fun to continue. We were rapidly approaching Halloween, and Captain Tom kept a werewolf mask nicknamed Shaggy hidden in his room on the boat year-round. As a tradition, he would pull Shaggy out of hiding sometime during the month of October and would sneak around the boat at night in order to catch some unsuspecting soul walking around so he could jump out and scare the bejesus out of him. Shaggy got me real good a time or two, not because I was scared, but because I was surprised. Anyway, soon there was talk about a monster named Shaggy that roamed the halls and decks of the boat that added to Tex's anxiety. However, there was absolutely no way Captain Tom was going to catch Tex by surprise out on the deck at night, so he had to be a little more creative to get him with Shaggy. Late one night, Cecil, the pilot, asked Tex to come up to the wheelhouse and make him a pot of coffee. Tex was in the back of the wheelhouse, right in front of the stern window, with a dim light on, making a pot of Louisiana's finest, community coffee, New Orleans blend with chicory, when all of a sudden, Shaggy jumped up outside the window and howled. That poor old boy slung coffee all over the wheelhouse, tripped over his own feet, busted his ass, and nearly turned a cartwheel going down the steps to get away from Shaggy. It had all been a carefully orchestrated plan by Captain Tom and Cecil. Cecil wasn't even a coffee drinker, but he had required a pot that night because he was unusually tired after Tom/Shaggy had time to get into position under the wheelhouse window. Everyone on the crew was thoroughly entertained by the ruse except me. I was pissed because Tex refused to return to the wheelhouse for any reason, and it was left up to me to clean up the mess. In addition, my A1 deckhand, who had been so much help to me, had decided that he couldn't take any more and wanted a transfer off the boat. I had initially refused to clean up the mess in the wheelhouse, but I thought better of it and seized the opportunity to bitch at the wayward wheelmen that were about to run off a damn good deckhand. I was showing my ass the whole time I was sweeping up coffee grinds. I let it be known that if I were to end up as a single man on the deck again because of their shenanigans, that I would refuse to lay a single wire without a wheelman getting up off watch to come out on the tow to assist me. Furthermore, if they didn't like it, then they could fire me and I would move on too. Then who would build the damn tow? I ran it and slung shit around the wheelhouse during the whole time I was cleaning up the wheelhouse, putting way more effort into my hissy fit than into my restoration of the wheelhouse. When I left, it was with a storm of cuss words, and I slammed every freaking door on the boat on my way down for good measure. The next day, Captain Tom called a meeting of the entire crew and announced that everyone was to stop the child's play that had been directed at Tex due to his sanguinariophobia, tetraphobia, and phasmophobia. No one knew what those words meant. Captain Tom was a smart man, but everyone got the gist of the meeting, which meant to leave poor old Tex the fuck alone before a wheelman, namely the captain, has to get up in the middle of the night and build tow. Anyhow, that's what I got from the conversation. Captain Tom met privately with Tex to apologize and to ask for the young man to give the crew another chance before reporting to the office and requesting a transfer. I should have known something was not right when Captain Tom apologized and or took my temper tantrum into account. Tom is a good man with a caring disposition, but he would never normally apologize to a mere deckhand for any reason. I would soon learn that the offer of amends was a ploy to have Tex relax and let his guard down while Tom, Cecil, and Bruce the engineer set up for the grand finale on Halloween night. I guess I was no longer cool, since I was not hip to what had been happening to our deckhand, so I was totally unaware of and unprepared for what happened on that Halloween night. Surprisingly, there was no wake-up call that night. I was awake in time to go on watch, but with no one knocking on my door, I figured that someone had been kind enough to let me sleep in, so I smoked a cigarette and rolled over, thankful for some much-needed extra rest. When I did get up, it was to the sound of the general alarm and the shouts of, "Man overboard!" I jumped into my pants, threw my shirt on inside out, grabbed my boots, and busted through the bunk room door. Every floodlight on the boat was turned on as the spotlights frantically cut through the dark in search of our deckhand, Tex, who had gone overboard. I was ordered to drop the skiff, and I was being assisted by Bruce, who had something red smeared all over his shirt. "What did y'all do?" I screamed at Bruce while we were lowering the skiff. He looked embarrassed and shook his head. I jumped in the skiff, fired that sucker up, and cut out of there like I was aboard the Hydruptor, an experimental rig dreamed up by a crazy Frenchman. I had a deckhand that had become my friend and towboat brother to save. The chance of survival from falling overboard in the Mississippi River is slim to none, especially in the congested areas between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Fortunately, it was during low river when the incident occurred. The alarm was immediately sounded, and the crew acted promptly. Cecil had also kept a sharp lookout and had kept eyes on Tex the entire time. He guided me to where Tex was using a VHF radio. When I made it to Tex, he was in a panic, trying to stay afloat and spewing about as much water as he was swallowing. It is extremely risky to attempt a man-overboard rescue in a skiff. If you venture too close to a man in panic mode, you risk him grabbing the side of the skiff, capsizing it, and pulling you under for your own drowning. I threw out the small life ring that was stored in the skiff and attached to the bow, but Tex was too blinded by fear to notice. I began to circle Tex while gently explaining to him that he had to calm down before I could help him. My words did nothing to help the situation, and I knew there was little time before hypothermia robbed Tex of his ability to tread water. I took one of the paddles out of the bottom of the skiff and used it to swat Tex lightly on the top of the head while I screamed at him to calm the fuck down and grab the life ring. I'm not sure if hitting a man in the head with an oar while he is drowning is standard operating procedure or not, but it seemed to have enough shock value that Tex did become aware of my intentions, and he grabbed the ring and held on for dear life. It was my intentions to drag Tex back to the boat where I would have some assistance in getting him out of the water without flipping the skiff. Tex had other ideas about the matter, however, and he let go of the life ring on my final approach to the vessel. I thought he was too tired to hang on any longer and that the situation had gone from bad to worse. When I circled back around, however, Tex was screaming at me through chattering teeth that he would not go back to that goddamn boat. Whatever Tex had been exposed to recently, he was more scared of than drowning in the mighty Mississippi. As soon as I realized that fact, I told Tex to grab a hold of the flotation device and I would drag him to the bank instead. Miraculously, he complied and I raced for the water's edge. Tex was finally saved, but instead of being hailed as a hero in an emergency situation, I was brought before a panel of investigators and interrogated along with the entire crew. The authorities had been notified when the man overboard occurred, and we all had some explaining to do. It was easy to keep my mouth shut during the inquiry because I had no knowledge of the events that had led up to Tex being in the water. Evidently, a diabolical plan had been developed for an extravagant trick-or-treat joke to be played on Tex. The pilot, Cecil, is a big old boy from Mountain Home, Arkansas. He wears his hair cut short in a GI style and has teeth that are stained nearly black from chewing tobacco all his life. When you see him, you can't help but think of Billy Bob Thornton in the role of Carl in the movie Sling Blade. The resemblance is uncanny. So, Cecil, had woke Tex up on Halloween night by walking into his room with a fire axe dripping ketchup. He grinned a deranged maniac's grin with his black teeth and told Tex to get up and join the party. He swiped his finger through the ketchup on the blade of the axe and sucked it off of his finger. Slowly he turned with the laugh of a madman and exited Tex's room. Tex was up in a flash, running to the wheelhouse for assistance from the captain, who was laid back in the wheelhouse chair, eyes closed and ketchup all over his shirt. Tex was scared to death and he bolted downstairs in search of someone alive and breathing to help him. Downstairs he found Bruce jammed in the half-closed doorway of the engine room, eyes closed and ketchup smeared all over his shirt as well. About that time, Cecil walked through the side door in the room where Tex was and started laughing his deranged laugh again. Tex couldn't stand it anymore. He had been scared out of his wits and past the point of any reasoning capabilities. He ran out the watertight door of the engine room, screaming at the top of his lungs, jumped from the boat onto the barge, and dove head first into the muddy waters of the Mississippi, intent on swimming to the safety of shore. Captain Tom and Cecil dang near got jail time from that little fiasco, but were hit instead with a stiff fine and probation. The rest of us were given probation as well, and we all had to attend some management and workplace ethics classes. Tex had been tricked, and we were treated to a black mark on our records. Remember, you can't live your life in fear, and most of what we fear won't hurt us anyhow. But it sure can make us hurt ourselves. Happy Halloween.